Welcome to the Hidden History Happy Hour podcast with Alex Dean and Bryan Cunningham. Here we have a drink, have a laugh, and you just might learn something about our favorite stories from history.
Please visit our website at hiddenhistoryhappyhour.com and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you like the show, please rate us 5 stars and leave a review. Cheers.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Hidden History Happy Hour with me, Bryan, and Alex Dean. And today we have a fantastic special guest. You might be forgiven after this episode if you conclude that our name should be Hidden History of Obscure Lake Battles Happy Hour, but it's not. This is just such an amazing story, and we have such a great storyteller. We had to do it. Alex, over to you.
My friend Willard Foxton, Willard Foxton Todd, your married name, I've known for over 20 years. One of my favorite facts about Willard is that in making a TV show about 28 dates on 28 different dating sites, he met his wife. And I have always wanted to ask Willard, first of all, welcome to the show. And second of all, did you meet her on date 28, or did you have to keep going on other dates and explain to this girl that you really liked that you were just doing it for professional reasons?
So I met her about date 24. So it was towards the end.
Lucky.
But there was definitely like a point where like she wanted to go exclusive, and I was like, but I have to finish the blog, right? Like, so
hey, art comes first. Art comes first. Art before love. Well, listeners, as you know, here at the Hidden History Happy Hour, we not only inform and entertain, we also try to help with your imbibing pleasures, of course, in a safe way. And as we've worked through the show, we've decided it's a good idea to offer our special guests the ability to choose the particular beverage of that show. So, Willard, what are we drinking today?
I think we should definitely be drinking Lamb's Navy Rum.
That's exactly what I've got. It's exactly what I've got in front of me.
It's the classic rum of British wardrooms throughout the First and Second World War. I personally, not particularly classic, drinking mine with Coke at the moment, which I think any Jack Tar would be appalled by, but there you go.
Quite right.
But we know it's late there.
Yeah, it's late for us, but I'm having the classic dark rum, none of your white rum for me.
Hey, so Willard, I have to ask you a question that I asked Alex in an earlier episode, and he, to be honest, didn't really know the answer. When do you think the practice of issuing British Navy officers a rum ration ended?
It's very late. It's very late indeed. I have a wonderful.
That was my answer.
I have a wonderful photo of an admiral. I did a lot of filming on the British aircraft carrier, obviously, as part of Top Gun, because we were filming Brits going to Top Gun. So there's a wonderful photo of a British admiral drinking rum from the barrel, which must have been taken in, I believe, the early 90s. So I would say
after the Falklands.
Yes, I think it's after the Falklands. I think it's early 90s, if I had to guess.
So the dispute that we were having, and maybe you've done some sneaky research to prove me wrong, Bryan, but my point was that it was issued at special occasions until very, very recently. It may even still be. But the daily tots of rum that we were discussing, that went before the Falklands. That was the dispute we were having.
Oh, well, I know for a fact that the Queen Elizabeth, certainly I don't know about the Prince of Wales, the other carrier, but I know the Queen Elizabeth has a pub on board. So you can certainly pop down for a rum anytime you fancy it, which of course American sailors are hugely jealous of because the US Navy is still completely dry. Completely dry to the point where if you're served a beer on an American, because they do have beer for special occasions. So like if it's President's Day, I think you get like 1 beer per crewman, but they open all the beers before they issue them because otherwise people would hoard them. And so the US Navy is still like by and large dry, which I think is astonishing.
Good grief. It's against the spirit of the whole thing.
I cannot, as an American in good conscience, defend that practice. I just can't. So Willard, I've actually taken a look at your impressive filmography, and might be a little bit too soon, but I just want to ask you, I assume your production of Kinky Britain doesn't have anything to do with your dating experience.
Well, I mean, you would be surprised. I mean, I think one of my favorite bits of that dating experience was when a vicar in the Church of England sent me a message asking me whether, as part of a dating experience, I would like to go to her house and she would lock me in a cage and then whipped me while her husband weed on me through a rubber tube. And then the best thing about that was she was so polite, because she ended the message with, "Do let me know if that would be your cup of tea." And I was like,
so to speak.
Well, not my cup of tea, but there you go.
There goes our clean rating. We may be bleeping some of that out for the benefit of our extended audience, but on cleaner topics that Willard covered, I assume, inside Obama's White House is one of your success stories, and I know that inside Top Gun was a great connect, and very timely too, because they're remaking it, right? Or they
absolutely. Well, they've just done Top Gun 2, and I think we were in the pitch for inside Top Gun. We told them that we would definitely be coming out at the same time as the Tom Cruise movie, but we obviously got things done a lot faster than Hollywood, so can't complain too much about that. But yeah, it was fascinating. It was a great experience filming at the Navy Fighter Weapons School, and that was absolutely bonkers. I think one of my favorite moments in doing that was the commissioner for the British broadcaster who commissioned it. Before I got on the plane, he took me to one side and he went, "Willard, I want you to promise me that you will get an American flight instructor standing in front of a jet, and they turn the jet engine on, and I want the American to say, 'Hear that? That's the sound of freedom.'"
Well, Art, two little bits of trivia. One is, as I sit here right now, I'm about 35 miles from Miramar, so I will especially be looking forward to the release of the film, and I hope we'll be able to put on our website some places where people in North America can see it. Back to your earlier point, which I know we don't want to delve too deeply into, but as our listeners know, my father was actually a minister in the American branch of the Church of England, the American Episcopal Church. And I'm also put in memory of a limerick, which I will simply start and not finish, that says, "There once was a bishop from Birmingham."
Yes, I know the rest of that, and people can look that up if they would like to. As you know, Willard, this podcast is based on a book that I wrote, and after I finished the book, I kept telling stories online in my Dean History series, and I told a Miramar story, as a matter of fact. I told stories of two incredibly expensive fighter jets that were all trashed one after another by pilots who were trying to wiggle out of their trousers to have a pee mid-flight, and one of them was going back to Miramar. It's multi-million-dollar expense caused by pilots ejector seating after getting their gear stick stuck. No pun intended. This is the smuttiest episode we've ever recorded.
It really is
some way.
It really is. Talking about pulling the escape hatch, Alex.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to tell a story if it kills me. I am now going to tell the story of Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, the Lion of Africa. Lettow-Vorbeck survived the First World War, and in his memoirs gave us some glimpses of his life before it. As a professional soldier in the German military, the great Prussian machine before the First World War. Apart from other things, recalls his memories of von Moltke, the military strategist who was famously supposed to have laughed only twice in his life. Once when told that a particular French fortress was absolutely impregnable, and the other when he was informed that his mother-in-law had died. Anyway, Lettow-Vorbeck served under him and was posted to German Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. At the start of the 20th century, he was a man of some real personal bravery. He lost an eye there in the course of battle, and it was a lot of that fighting that taught him what we now call guerrilla warfare. Anyway, when the First World War came, he was commanding German forces in East Africa. His force was called Schutztruppe, and that force was tiny. 5,000 men, half German volunteers and non-commissioned officers, half indigenous troops, and they were called Askaris. And there was, my first question for you guys, there was talk of African colonies being declared neutral in the conflict in the First World War, because in the 19th century, the great powers had contemplated and even not quite negotiated, but discussed colonies remaining inviolate and neutral during German conflicts. I wonder if you guys knew that.
I was really interested to read that in the story, Alex, and it kind of led me to the question of sort of why bother, right? So it's clear in the story that despite all of his heroics, everything that happened in Africa was more or less a sideshow. And if that's the case throughout the colonies, you might say, why bother? Why not concentrate the forces where the fight is? I guess everyone's trying to circle a flank and get the advantage, right?
Did you know that one, Willard?
I had no idea. I did not know that they discussed that sort of thing.
It's such a weird idea, isn't it?
My sort of understanding of Africa kind of finishes about the history of Africa kind of starts in sort of the sort of 1700s and goes to about the sort of end of the Belgian regime in the Congo, because I've read Adam Hochschild's brilliant book about the Belgian Congo, which covers a lot of that, but then doesn't really pick up again until about 1914. So I think I've probably missed that crucial period between about 1898 and 1914 where happened, but I didn't know.
Well, of course, the Belgians were famously appalling colonial masters. Anyway, so the point is, this was mooted that his territory might be neutral, and Leto-Vorbeck was having none of that. Instead, he battled the Allies with his starting force of 5,000 wherever he could find them. He fought the British, he fought the Belgians, he fought the Indians, he fought the Portuguese, forces much, much larger than his own. He fought the lot. Pitched battles like the Battle of Tanga, which was a defensive battle for German territory that they held, and the Battle of Jasin, where he attacked and defeated a British force. The British force surrendered to him. The commanding officer was killed, but the people who were left in charge were ushered into his presence. He congratulated them warmly on their excellent defense of Jasin, and then released them on their own recognizance, on their promise to play no further parts in the war. I suppose that he also didn't really want to burden himself with a lot of prisoners of war. But I thought that was interesting that, as a man of honor, he would just take someone's word that they would play no further part in the conflict and then let them go. He mounted raids into British colonial territory in what's now Kenya and now Uganda. He had a scuttled ship, took naval guns off it and used them in the field. And so all these kind of stories of his heroics grew, and his forces grew as a result to, at its height, 14,000 fighting men, as men in the region were drawn to this strong man who spoke to them in his fluent Swahili, and they came to fight, really not for Imperial Germany, they came to fight for Leto-Vorbeck. And as you were implying, Brian, when we were discussing the field of war, he knew that his theatre would never be central to the conflict's outcome. His aim was to make the Allies commit as many troops as possible to the fight against him, and thus depriving them of resources.
Question about that, Alex.
On the front. Yeah, go ahead.
So we've talked before in the context of both the War of 1812 and frankly Hamilton about the need by men, particularly in those days, but people, to show their glory, show their honor, demonstrate that they're in the fight. And I wonder how much you think in his case it was, I will defend Germany at all costs, versus I love to have war and I want glory and I want to fight.
Well, of course, in every professional soldier, I think there's a sense of pride in doing one's best and in serving the force of arms as best one can. But as a career, as a profession. But I think too that in those circumstances, he felt that every bit he was able to draw away from the Allies was helping Mother Germany all the more. So I suppose my answer was my fatherland, rather. So I suppose my answer is both. Anyway, the point is, as time went on, whilst he continued to accumulate victories, circumstances naturally were harder and harder for Leto-Vorbeck. Always facing superior numbers, deprived of support and material from Germany because the British were successfully blockading. His men fought on using the weapons they captured from those that they defeated. Supplies dwindled, rations were cut, they still fought on. In other environments like that, certainly the colonial subjects would have deserted the banner, right? What did they owe to far-off Germany? But the Askaris under Leto-Vorbeck did not, because they fought for him. Anyway, towards its conclusion of the war, one interesting thing, Leto-Vorbeck was the only person to take British towns, the only German to successfully capture British settlements in the entire conflict. Secondly, Leto-Vorbeck remained undefeated at the end of the war. He surrendered after the armistice, because it took so long for the news to get to Africa, by agreement, and he surrendered on his own terms in a place of his own naming. And indeed, because of the time that it took for that message to get there, he and his men were the last men fighting the First World War, and they fired its last shots well after the armistice. And when they finally surrendered, we, the British, wryly realized that the men we captured were armed only and solely with weaponry they'd taken from us, with weaponry they'd taken from the forces they defeated. I'm going to say one more thing about this, then I'm going to shut up and see what you think about it. Because this is how things were done in the colonies at the time, the Germans were separated out from the Askaris, their colonial soldiers. When Leto Vorbeck was separated out in the prisoner of war camp from the Askaris he had led throughout this conflict, his African Askaris formed up into ranks in the prison camp and cried out and begged the British to be allowed to follow him. And they didn't know where he was going. They just begged to be able to follow the man that they had followed and loved. And I thought that was, you don't often get stories about German heroism in either of the Great Wars, and certainly in this forgotten area of colonial conflict, it was a story I thought that deserved to be told.
Yeah, that is dedication.
Can I round off that story with a great little sort of anecdote that I know from having done quite a few films out there. So in the 1950s, it became apparent that effectively the Germans owed pensions to all of those Askaris. And they decided that we're going to pay them. But of course, so they went out and they tried to find all the Askaris. But of course, the Askaris didn't have any of their pay books. They'd been following Leto Vorbeck through like swamps and jungles and so on. So they had no pay books, they had no uniforms, they'd been using captured equipment. So they had no way of proving who had been an Askari and who had not. And so the German civil servant who went out there to find these Askaris, he came up with a very simple system. He said, essentially, if you were one of von Leto Vorbeck's Askaris, you can come to my office and I've got a Mauser rifle in my office. And if you can perform the 1914 Schutztruppen Manual of Arms in my office, you'll get a pension from the German government. And hundreds of old men came and got their pension from
these. That's amazing. Willard, I promise our listeners that was not set up. I think that is fantastic.
Yeah, and, that's crazy. We didn't know that.
I didn't know that. Let me give you a PS that I think is also great. After the war, Leto Vorbeck goes back to Germany and he tries to go into politics. But of course, after a time, the fates were against him because he was not in favor of the rise of Hitler. Mm-hmm. And indeed, Hitler wanted this war hero, this man who was looked up to on his side. And here goes our clean rating. Leto Vorbeck, when being offered an important ambassadorship by the Führer, told Hitler to go fuck himself. And I think that is a great mark of the man. Nevertheless, of course, he lost his sons and his son-in-law, all died in fighting for Germany in the Second World War. And I think that to the last, Leto Vorbeck, for all the faults of Imperial Germany, of course, he remained an example of the different history that his country and its people could have had but for Nazism.
Yeah, it's a tragedy all around. I wonder, Alex, does history record, well, first of all, at what year, what time period was it when he rejected Hitler? Was it early on?
It was in the 30s. So I think when Hitler was chancellor, but before full-blown insanity.
So does history record what he felt was so much worse about Nazism at that time than Kaiserism that made him reject?
Than just militarism. Well, he certainly wasn't a fascist. He wasn't a fascist. He wasn't a Nazi. He didn't believe in, as far as I know, and all that I've read about him, he's had no sympathy with the treatment of the Jews or other minorities in the way that the Führer wished to. And I also think, as many soldiers did, that he thought that further militarism on the European continent at that time was a very bad idea for Germany. No matter how much you resented Versailles, the notion of another land war was one opposed almost most of all by those who'd fought the last one.
Right.
And there were plenty of people banging drums and saying, the militarism and restore German pride. Plenty of the older generation of the Junkers and the Prussian officers were many of them were reluctant. And of course, that's where some of the failed hopes of a coup against Hitler came from, that older officer class who in the end bottled it, but at least to their partial credit didn't back Hitler in a way that many others did.
Well, Alex, as the comedians say, you've successfully wall-to-walled our conversation because, as we know, Tom Cruise, Maverick and Top Gun, also one of the key German attempted assassins of Hitler in
Yeah.
Valkyrie. So
Yes.
way to tie that together.
Mm.
More seriously, and I'm curious, Willard, to your thoughts and how this fits into your story, if at all. This kind of gets us to a theme that's come up many times so far in our podcast, which is, to what extent are professional soldiers tainted by the evilness or the oppressiveness of the cause of the leaders of the country they fight for? And I wonder if you can forgive a German soldier in the First World War in a way that you wouldn't in the Second World War. Does it depend on how much they knew at the time? Does the fact that you swore an oath to defend your country defeat all? How do you feel about that?
I think it's a very difficult question. And I think ultimately, like, you can read about people who fought for these totalitarian states. I'm a huge fan of, I don't know if you've ever read Robert Forsyth's books on the Eastern Front. He's a tank colonel, American tank colonel. And he's written two brilliant books on the Eastern Front. And the kind of, I sort of hugely find myself drawn to and respecting the kind of toughness of the Soviet troops out there, and thinking about sort of what people were doing out there on the Eastern Front and so on and so forth. It's very difficult to pair that out from the horror of the regimes that are engaged in that combat. And I suppose there's a part of me, sort of, I'm kind of heavily engaged in the world of model soldiers and things like, reenactment and things like. I don't do any reenactment, but there's always a part of me that, like, when you meet people who are reenactors in particular, there's like some people who are in it for a bit of fun, and there are some people who like dressing up in Nazi uniforms a bit too much, and I think
right. We don't have any of those people in the United States, by the way, Mark.
Of course not.
So can I just give you what I'm going to get Willard to tell his story, but I'll tell you one thing that I thought was interesting from your question, Brian, about whether you would condemn the behavior of somebody serving one regime when you wouldn't the other. I told the story about a great British hero called Yeo Thomas, Wing Commander Forrest Yeo Thomas, who won the Military Cross during his efforts to help the French resistance. After the war was finished, after the Second World War was finished, he was a key witness at the Nuremberg trials because he'd been imprisoned at Buchenwald. But he was also a key witness at the trial of a German opposite number of his in the Waffen-SS, Otto Skorzeny. And Skorzeny was accused of a war crime by wearing US uniforms behind Allied lines. And Yeo Thomas said, we did the same thing. We wore German uniforms behind enemy lines during the course of our operations, and he led to the acquittal of the soldier who was on trial. And I thought that was admirable, not least because victor's justice can't extend to condemning someone for doing precisely the same thing that you did, can it?
Well, unless on your side it was done by rogue soldiers against orders,
sure,
it was doctored.
Sure.
But let's just to press this point a little bit more, and I can't wait to hear Willard's story. If anyone has not been to the museum in Berlin of the Berlin Wall, which is not exactly what it's called, but that's what it is, there's a great exhibit about the East German soldiers on the wall during the Cold War. Alex, I won't say the height of the Cold War, during various points in the Cold War, who deliberately held their fire while people ran across the no man's land into West Germany. So I wonder, do we count those soldiers as more heroic than soldiers who followed orders? You'd think so, right?
Yeah. Maybe, especially because it could be someone you know, right? But anyway, sorry, go on, Willard.
I was going to say something I really sort of stuck with me reading Anne Applebaum's brilliant book about the Gulag, which is just called Gulag. Was the fact that there are quite a lot of people who resist totalitarian regimes, but they often resist them with no sort of like heroic intent. They are just kind of awkward people. They're like awkward, difficult people who often would resist a democratic regime. And it's really fascinating. In that book, it talks about like the sort of things people in the Gulag for, a sort of very basic act of resistance, where all they would have to have done was comply to an extent I think almost anyone else would have done, because they're sort of so awkward and they just won't be pushed around. They go, well, fuck you, and end up in, spending decades kind of in these horrific camps and things like that. So there's a part of me that feels like those acts of resistance to tyranny in those situations like East Germany, like they will have known when they didn't pull the trigger that they and probably their families were going to have an absolutely appalling time. And I think it is quite a heroic decision to say, yes, I'm not going to kill that person. And I
think the Willard Foxton heroism equation is heroism minus previous tendency to be an asshole anyway.
Well, so that's Mary Lindell, who's one of the British partners of the French resistance. Her brother, after the war, said that she'd only been so awkward with the Gestapo because she was so awkward with everybody. So, it's reinforcing your point, Willard. Right, Willard, we're going to...
Oh, I'm going to run over time. I was about to share an anecdote from my grandfather about Douglas Bader. So my grandfather was a fighter pilot during the Second World War, and he was a Fleet Air Arm, which is our sort of equivalent of the naval aviators in the US. So we're back to the round again on the Top Gun, top marks for our kind of setup and payoffs here. Right. But he was a naval aviator in the Second World War, but during the Battle of Britain, they were very short of aviators, so they had to pull in guys who had any sort of fighter training. So he flew in the Battle of Britain, and he did fly with Douglas Bader, but absolutely detested Douglas Bader because he was an absolute shit. But
this is not the conventional history. I love it.
No. One of the key things I think about people like that, though, is if you were a kind of mild-mannered person who was not a really difficult individual, there is absolutely no way you would be the sort of person who could have both your legs cut off in a flying accident and have the determination to be like, I'm going to get back in a plane. I'm going to force the RAF to change all the rules to let me back in a fighter plane. And I think that there is an element of these people who are just extremely difficult, and like a lot of heroes are not nice people. Like Otto Skorzeny definitely, for example, did not deserve to swing at Nuremberg. Yeah. He was definitely an arsehole, though.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing, right? History needs assholes, I guess.
Well, this is by some way our sweariest podcast. Willard, I am going to invite you to tell us your brilliant story.
Okay, so this once again features a not perfect individual as its central character. And its central character is a man called Geoffrey Spicer Simpson, Lieutenant Commander Geoffrey Spicer Simpson. And this happens during the First World War. And Spicer Simpson has a very bad start to his First World War, because what happens is he's in command of a destroyer in the Royal Navy, and he is asked to sort of look after a fairly small port with his small destroyer. And he takes time off from being in command of this destroyer to go to a local hotel to entertain some local dignitaries. And he insists that under naval regulations, he's fine to do this because he can still see his ship through the window. And therefore he is watching through the window, eating his Sunday lunch when a German U-boat torpedoes his destroyer and it sinks without him on board. And he gets into quite a lot of trouble for this. And he is effectively sort of posted to a department of the Admiralty where nobody cares about him, and he is not going to have a good war, effectively. Everyone else gets to go out to the North Sea and stand in the salt and the rain looking for the high seas fleet, but he is sent to the colonial department of the Royal Navy, which is not going to be doing anything during World War I, or so everybody thinks. However, he does not take this lying down, and he decides what happens is, apparently, so essentially my sources for this are, there's a wonderful book by Giles Foden called Mimi and Tutu Go Forth. You'll find out why it's called Mimi and Tutu Go Forth soon, which recounts Spicer Simpson's background. But there's lots of other sources you can look at, but that's the best one, the most easily available one, if you want to read more on it, or fact check me, because I'm bound to get a few things wrong here. But essentially, a big game hunter comes to him, and this big game hunter tells Spicer Simpson about this incredible danger to British and Belgian colonies in Tanzania, or Tanganyika as it was then. And that is, the big game hunter has discovered that the Germans have effectively IKEA'd a battleship to to East Africa. So essentially the Germans, obviously Lake Tanganyika is an enormous lake. It's one of the largest bodies of water in the world. But it's hundreds of miles from the sea, so you can't get a ship there. So what the Germans did to secretly breaking colonial treaties to get a ship there was they sent it nut by nut and bolt by bolt through the post. And slowly, over about 10 years, they constructed a...
Through the post.
It's like the Sears and Roebuck of World War I.
Like one of those magazines.
Absolutely.
You get hits off the front.
Sears and Roebuck of World War I.
Yeah. So what they did, and this was a total secret before World War One, but in secret, they basically had all these parts. And if it kicked off in Africa, they were going to be able to assemble this battleship and put it on the lake. This was the plan. And when I say a battleship, I'm being slightly hyperbolic. It's like a 1,500-ton steamer. So it's not a real battleship in the sense of, sort of your kind of Iowa or whatever.
Enough to
pretty powerful on that lake, though.
Enough to dominate the lake.
Absolutely. In the context of that situation, it is by far and away the most powerful ship on the lake. So this big game hunter comes and tells him that this is happening, and sure enough, the Germans, after a period of several months, build the battleship. Presumably the instructions are quite well laid out. I assume that they're left with like 15 bits left over, and they're like, "Oh, that's probably not important."
Always.
And an
Allen key.
Absolutely. So with their kit IKEA battleship, they put it onto the lake and they sail around the lake, destroying all of the Belgian bases, sinking all of the Belgian tax baits, and effectively, because they control not only the lake but also the traffic across the lake in this sort of trackless and totally undeveloped part of Africa, they effectively control all of the highways and effectively run everything and take control of the whole of the heart of Africa, and nobody can do anything about it, or so the Germans think. However, they have reckoned without Spicer Simpson and his tiny budget at the Admiralty. So Spicer Simpson, what he does is he convinces the higher ups at the Admiralty that because the Germans have floated a ship on Lake Tanganyika, then the Royal Navy has not merely, they don't merely have a need, but they have a legal obligation to actually put ships on the lake and go and fight them. But unfortunately, the British don't have time to IKEA the ship there, and the budget is very low. So what he gets is 2 torpedo boats, which he wants to call Dog and Cat, but he's not allowed to by the Admiralty, so he has to come up with a different name. So he calls them Mimi and Tutu.
That's Mimi and Tutu. Okay.
Yeah, that's Mimi and Tutu.
Which of course mean...
Dog and cat in French.
Yeah.
Or I believe it's woof and meow in French, I think is so it's a sort of a play on their sort of really called Dog and Cat, but you had to sort of slip it under the door with the requisition form. Anyway, so he gets these 2 torpedo boats, then he has to assemble a crew to crew them, and he puts together this absolutely bonkers group of people, literally he ends up with 2 rugby players because he finds them in a pub and they're just great chaps, so he gets this incredible group of people. Like his chief engineer
is that impressment, Alex?
No, it is not.
It's not impressive. He meets 2 London Scottish rugby players in a pub and convinces them to go on an adventure. That's not impressive.
Convinces. They didn't make them.
That's exactly the difference. Yeah,
it was a throwback, Willard. But
so he obviously convinces these, this group of people, probably about 40 or 50 people, to go on this trip. And the plan is, and I don't think this is a particularly good plan, and I think everyone at the Admiralty just assumed that they'd get on a boat and they'd never see them ever again, was they're going to sail they're going to put the torpedo ships on a cargo ship, the torpedo boats. They're going to sail them to Cape Town. Now, I don't know how good your geography is, but you'll note that Cape Town is approximately a continent away from Tanzania. Yes. So the plan is they'll get them off the ship in Cape Town.
We've been there together, haven't we, Willard?
We have been Cape Town together.
Yes, yeah, good.
Many years ago. Table Mountain, it's nice. Top recommendations. So then they'll get the railway to effectively the north of South Africa, and then they'll take the torpedo boats off the train. They are then at that point on the railway, which is the sort of great Cape to Cairo line that Cecil Rhodes had been intending to build that was never completed. They are, I think, approximately 400 or 500 miles through the jungle.
This is nuts.
So they get to the end of the railway line, and they've also got 2 traction engines they've bought apparently for a very good price in South Africa.
I'm dragging a boat through the jungle.
How many buyers are there for traction engines in that location?
I don't know.
Seller's market, mate. Seller's market.
Absolutely. So they buy the traction engines, they take them, and then they pull these 2 torpedo boats 500 miles through untracked, unexplored wilderness. They have to climb mountains, they have to cross plateaus, they have to kill lions, they have to fight off hippos. They are incredibly lucky in the sense that the doctor is a world-renowned authority on tropical medicine. And I think the most incredible part of this story is the fact that they do that 500-mile journey. And bearing in mind, people like Lodneto Vorbeck, who was no slouch about, sort of losing men, was looked after his men very well, but still lost, sort of 20 to 30% of people through sickness. They didn't lose a single man to illness going.
Well, Lard, let me just interrupt this amazing story real quick to tease our listeners with the future guest, the great historian of the flu pandemic in the United States, John Barry, who writes that a goal of a lot of American medical experts at the time was to make World War I the first war in history that fewer people were lost from disease than from combat. And it sounds to me like you're saying these guys achieved that in this operation.
In this operation, yes, but failed overall.
Yeah.
Sorry, go.
So essentially, they get through the jungle. I think this ranks with like Shackleton's mission, the pole. They get through the jungle. They get the boats intact. The range that they're going on is the journey they're going on is so difficult. They have to build 150 bridges to get to the lake, right? And many of those bridges, at least 70 or 80 of these bridges, were still in use in like 2012 when I last looked closely at this for television. I looked into recreating this journey, but basically insurance companies just like screamed in horror at the idea of it. But essentially, yes, so they managed to get the torpedo boats to the lake. They get them on the lake. And then the Germans have a small fleet of ships. They've captured lots of the Belgian ships, and they start picking the German ships off one by one. And
I love it.
They do boarding actions. They, on Christmas, on Boxing Day, one day, a German ship hoves into sight and they leap into the torpedo boat. And Spicer Simpson
on a public holiday.
Leaps aboard.
I just want our executive producer and Hollywood bigwig Ivan Williams to recognize that this is the next big Mark Wahlberg movie, and Alex and Willard and I have the rights to it.
We have the right to this one. Carry on.
Absolutely, yeah. So effectively, they take all the small boats. They take all the small boats that the Germans have been using to kind of control the lake, and they then have a fleet. They have a fleet of about 5 or 6 ships. And the conflict between them and the German battleships, the Graf von Gotzen, this incredible showdown is ready to happen. But the Germans decide that effectively they can't beat 5 or 6 ships. So what they do is they scuttle the Graf von Gotzen rather than fight the British. And so you end up in a situation where Spicer Simpson manages to not only retake the lake, but retake the whole heart of Africa. So in terms of territory captured, he captures more
single most significant thing.
Yeah.
I don't know, Alex. I don't know, Alex. This might eclipse your story of the most complete defeat.
No, I'm not sure. That's 0 casualties, but this is superb. Finish your thought, Willard. Sorry.
But they don't lose. They don't. So in sinking the battleship, in getting there with the torpedo boats, they don't lose a single man doing it. And he.
Well, that's pretty amazing. Okay.
Returns to Britain a hero. He made the very sensible decision to take a tabloid journalist with him from the Daily Mirror, who obviously writes this up in glowing terms. And he returns to Britain a hero. And there are lots of accounts of the voyage, essentially, and there are sort of multiple competing accounts of what happened, but those are the sort of key facts. And obviously Spicer Simpson is he's a buffoon. He's a larger than life character. And I think, as I said about, Bader, like the truth is, to even attempt something like that,
right,
you've got to have a bit of a screw loose.
Yeah, the character.
If only Michael Caine were 30 years younger.
Question. Well, I told, of course, in the book the story of the Calcutta Light Horse, which was who took on German ships in the neutral port of Goa, and they were led by some special operations executive old buffers in this. They were all old buffers as well, and they must have had several screws loose to do it. But when it comes off, isn't it a thing of beauty?
Yeah, our listeners are going to have to wait. Our listeners will have to wait for that story, Alex. But to your point about it's crazy right up until it's not. Am I incorrect in my research? And by research, I mean 5 minutes of searching Wikipedia, that up until a certain point, this whole operation was known as Simpson Circus. And at what point did that turn?
Well, I think that the truth about it is so effectively it gets that nickname from Rhodesian troops who are deployed alongside them, who think that the whole thing is absolutely ridiculous, and they mock a lot of the things that for all sorts of like tropical medicine reasons, they do things like they wear sun cream and they have like all sorts of insect repellent on them. So they're covered in this like World War I, like zinc-based sun cream. So they're all covered in kind of like white face paint all the time. So the
excellent camouflage.
Yeah, well, the reason they're known as Simpson Circus is because basically all the medical precautions
they look like clowns.
It made them look ridiculous. But the reason that they were doing it was, of course, because the tropical medicine doctor was like, "No, we have to do this." So I think and also they were very much, by the time they got to the lake, they were very much kind of like they'd been in the jungle for more than a year. Now, that's the other thing about this. This took
it took over a year.
Well, they have to build 150 bridges. I mean, they take like each bridge, like they're taking 2 or 3 days to build a bridge. I mean, that's pretty good going, But
I suppose, yeah. I've never built a bridge, but yeah, fair enough.
Ragged by the time they get there as well. So, for example, Spicer Simpson goes into action when he captures the German ship and leads the boarding action. He goes into action wearing only a skirt and nothing else. He's just got his cutlass, because all Royal Naval officers in World War I were issued with cutlasses. What the average naval officer in World War I, who of course is engaging his opponent from 14,000 yards away with a 14-inch gun, needs with a cutlass is not entirely clear. But Spicer Simpson makes good use of it. But yeah, no, so they are like bizarre looking because they have been, they've gone native in many ways. And in terms of going native, one of the things we're talking about, von Lettow-Vorbeck and his troops kind of, dedication to him. Spicer Simpson ends up being worshipped as a god by the local.
Of course.
Okay, you're pulling Alex now. That's good.
Absolutely. The local people who are known as the Hollow, like put up statues, and they have these statues of this like fat-bellied white man in a skirt. And this.
Oh, there's hope for me yet.
I mean, who doesn't have that?
This is an icon of Spicer Simpson because his victory was so complete over the Germans. And the Germans and the Belgians had dominated the lake, and he suddenly came from nowhere and defeated them all. And so the Hollow had been brutally treated by both the Belgians and the Germans. And Spicer Simpson was quite nice in comparison.
You liberated them.
Taxes.
You know what? Brian, I am going to concede defeat. This is a more complete victory than my story, the most complete victory.
It does seem it's the most complete victory.
Yes,
because it's like we don't have to pick one. But so Willard, are you saying if our listeners went to what used to be the Belgian Congo today, they would find a statue of this fat white guy in a skirt?
You can find them, yeah. So in Foden's book, he talks about going to a Hollow village and meeting an old man, because Hollow have largely died out. But he talks about meeting an old man who takes him and shows him one of these idols. So they still are out there. But one of the other things that's incredible is, although I did this on my honeymoon, actually, which sort of demonstrates the fact that any holiday can be used as an excuse to visit World War I battlefield. But essentially, the German battleship is scuttled, but it remains the only giant ship on the lake. And therefore, in the 1920s, an Irish engineer hits on the brilliant business idea of, I'll pump it out and fix it, and then I'll have a transport monopoly on the lake. And the ship, formerly the Graf von Gotzen, now known as the merchant vessel Liemba, is still plying the lake, and you can get it.
What you mean today?
Today, yeah, you can still ride. I rode on it.
Can you send us a picture that we can put in our show notes?
Yeah, that's amazing.
But it's still going. You can still ride on the Liemba, and it is a wonderful way to see. It is a wonderful way to see to see Lake Tanganyika. There's no better way to see it.
This sounds
by definition, there cannot be. I think we're going to have a hidden history happy hour field trip. And Willard, you will, and you and Mrs. Willard, Mrs. Foxton will of course be invited.
Yeah, I want to thank tour guides.
Willard, it has been absolutely great. Thank you so much. I think it's been a super episode. I never think we've sworn a lot. I've been crying with laughter a couple of times.
Willard,
fantastic.
Where can our listeners find your work in North America? Because I've had a little bit of a hard time with that.
So I think the most recent thing I've done, so I moved from doing television to doing audio fairly recently. And the best place they can go to find my stuff is on If you go onto Apple Podcasts and you look for, there's a BBC series we do called Sideways, which I think a lot of listeners to this show will really love. Essentially, every week we look at sort of big ideas in history and kind of reveal that, whether they're true or false and so on. It's hosted by a wonderful academic called Matthew Syed. So that's very
he's black box thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really great show that I'm heavily involved with. And another one that came out, it was world #1 podcast over Christmas, a podcast called Harsh Reality, which is about the most unethical reality show ever made, which obviously is quite an accolade.
It's going some, yeah.
That came out over Christmas. As I say, it was a world #1, and that is a great bit of my work that listeners can track down.
See you next time. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Hidden History Happy Hour podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for topics, you can find us on Twitter or on our website, hiddenhistoryhappyhour.com. We look forward to joining you next time.
We thank our gifted producers, Jeremy Core and Kate Cruz, and our visionary executive producer, Ivan Williams, without whom this podcast would be, well, history. And thanks also to our art designer, David Wardle.
Cheers.